started it.
Hi, I'm here.
So our topic was pollution and biodiversity, and the context of we basically chose. I think did recording start, or it says it's about to start.
It started.
Okay, great. So overexposure to unnatural sounds for long periods of time is what our main topic is, and basically sound is measured in decibels. So natural sounds like rustling leaves, thunder, and siren are all lower decibels, but if you look at unnatural sounds like a lawnmower, concert, or a sonar sound underwater, that's like from 90 to 235 decibels. And sounds over 85 decibels are significantly harmful for people's ears. um, Loud noises also impact nature and animals in different ways. Like we all know animals use their sound or their just their detection thing to find food, to find mates, to navigate, and then just to see where their predators might be located. So having these unnatural sounds interfere with the natural sounds is making it difficult for the animals to find food or navigate or attract males and stuff like that. Terrestrial animals aren't the only ones who are impacted because animals use echolocation like dolphins and whales, and they're heavily impacted by the oil drilling sounds and the sonar devices that interfere with their echolocation. So the problem is that urbanization is a major loss. A major driver of extinction due to habitat loss, fragmentation, and pollution. Man-made sounds generated in cities can lead to noise pollution. Noise pollution affecting biodiversity includes traffic sounds, ships, aircrafts, and industrial activities. Noise pollution affects animals by masking and inhibiting animal sounds or making it difficult for them to hear. It has always been shown to affect communication, use of space, and reproduction. Noise pollution affects a wide variety of organisms, including birds, amphibians, fish, mammals, invertebrates, and in many ecosystems. For example, a recent study found that zooplankton suffered high mortality from noise pollution and negative effects on fish development, such as malformations. For people's perspective, because we all learn best when it's affecting us, noise pollution led to fish communication, resulting in 80% loss in commercial catch. And also, for humans, it has shown that it makes us more aggressive, um, makes us more stressed, because noise pollution can lead to lack of sleep, and which can just make us more stressed in general. So some solutions to noise pollution. There's no short-term solutions right now. According to WHO, the best solution is to spread awareness and tell people how bad and how much the noise pollution is affecting our ecosystems. So what people can do is opt for alternative means of transport. Instead of using a car, you can use your bicycle or an electric vehicle that makes lesser sound. You can insulate your homes with noise absorbing materials, so the noise that less noise leaves your house and less noise enters your house. You can also do housework at a recommended time. So there's a recommended time frame by WHO for every city where you can do your housework, so everything is in at the same time. Government can also help by probably separating residential zones from zones that are high in noise pollution, like airports. They can also install insulations in all the new buildings that are being built. They can have fines for exceeding the noise limit. They can create a pedestrian area where limited traffic is allowed, and just to mainly offload goods at certain times, and probably use a material other than asphalt that absorbs more noise, that can potentially reduce our noise level to like 3 decibels. So yeah. Questions? Okay, thank you.
I didn't hear any questions, but I'll just chime in that there was a study ongoing up in Alaska, looking at how the absence of all the whale watching boats is making it easier for the whales to communicate because of all the tourists that are up there all the time, the boats droning in the water. And it's changed the behavior and the way that the whales are communicating to each other. Pretty cool. Right, I'm going to go visit another group for the next presentation. Bye.
So who's next? Do we know? What's the actual list of names? Why do I feel
believe
like
it's Carolina Parakeets.
it is me who's next? Love that. Okay, I'm gonna just share my screen with my presentation if I can figure out how. I sort of suck at technology, so we'll see how this goes.
Also, I'm sorry if y'all could hear me clicking because I thought like my computer said I was muted. So I'm sorry if that interrupted your presentation, Warda.
Can y'all see my thing? Hello?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, all right, lovelies. So, this is our presentation on climate change and terrestrial biodiversity. So first we wanted to set the context, and to do that we were going to talk about what some of the major drivers of biodiversity loss are. So of course there's land change use. If you're knocking down trees and that sort of thing to build parking lots and buildings, obviously you're going to lose some land and some species. There's infrastructure expansion, which goes hand in hand with development and that land change use. And then there's also climate change, of course, and we'll talk more about that later. But clearly, if you're changing the climate, you're changing the space that people are, or that organisms are living in. And that's not good, you know? Invasive species. Okay, so we've talked about this before in class, but if you're bringing in an invasive species to an area, they're going to be better adapted to different things that the native species might not be, and we just don't know how they're going to interact with everything there. So they could outcompete or, you know, predate on other species that are already there, and then we could lose those species. All right, so to get more specific with climate change and terrestrial biodiversity. Whew. Sorry, I get so nervous. Okay. The climate change causes a shift in seasons, which can change mating seasons and seasons for laying eggs and migrations and all of that sort of thing, which is going to cause some species to not be able to lay their eggs at the right time, and it's going to have a disruption in when things are born and that sort of thing, so they may not survive in the times that things are actually born and actually able to grow. And then, of course, climate change comes with higher temperatures, which goes hand in hand with the shift in species range. Because if the temperatures rise, species will try to move north to avoid these higher temperatures. But they can't always move north because there's other factors at play, like what the actual terrain of the area is and whether or not they can survive in that terrain. And then, of course, we have an increased amount of natural disasters like forest fires, floods, and that sort of thing that goes hand in hand with climate change and will, you know, kill the individuals who can't survive, which leads to decrease in biodiversity. All right. So we wanted to get a little more specific, and so we found this case study on the ring seal, which is the smallest and most common Arctic seal. And they're highly affected by climate change because, of course, they're in the Arctic and ice caps are melting, and those really cold regions are the most sensitive to climate change. And as an Arctic species, since they do spend most of their contact with ice, and that's really important to their survival, that loss of ice is really increasing the loss of their species and the loss of biodiversity among the species. So they birth and nurse their pups on the ice. So what's been happening with the loss of the ice is they've been birthing their pups, but then like the ice will melt, and so then their pups are out and about, and they can't be protected, or they get separated from their mother, and they end up dying. And they also live in snow caves, so without these caves, of course, they're not going to survive. And native populations of the area, especially indigenous people, depend on these Arctic species for food. So as these species are being lost, the people of that region are being affected as well. And of course, the other animals in the area. But I think, as Warda said earlier, we tend to feel it more when it's other people. So this is really impacting humans. All right, and so some general problems. The sea ice loss is affecting the feeding patterns of species in polar regions, like the ring seal. So just sort of going back to what we discussed a little bit earlier, it's affecting the food chain, it's affecting the feeding patterns, and it's just disrupting the system as a whole. The resulting sea ice loss, which is where most of the ring seal's feeding occurs, has also resulted in an overall decrease in body fat of the seal. So I think it was over the past 10 years or so, there's been a marked decrease in the body fat percentage of these seals. And so they're losing that. And that also means that they're losing heat in these cold environments. And so they're not being able to keep themselves warm when it does get cold and when those big changes do happen. And endemic Arctic species are also heavily affected by this loss of the sea ice. And the sea ice melting is increasing water levels, which is affecting the marine ecosystem as well. And loss in snow cover over the past 15 years has shown that the ring seal pups have been more frequently exposed to predation. So without this snow cover, these sea pups are a lot easier to see, and they are a lot easier to find and attack. And predators just get them a lot easier, so then we're losing those seals even more. And then a couple of solutions that we found. There is a Marine Mammal Protection Act, which has some things in place to try to prevent the loss of ice and prevent overhunting of these animals and that sort of thing. And a lot of times the biggest protectors for these species comes from local populations. So as we mentioned before, the indigenous people of the area really heavily rely on these seals and of the mammals of the region. So they have started to work with local preserves and government organizations to try to protect these seals. And I'll just let you read the more specifics on that. But the big thing you need to know is that the local people are really helping protect the animals more than the government alone. And these seals are constantly being monitored through research. So there's always research going on to try to assess the biodiversity of the species, and they're testing their genetics of the species to make sure that it's not a big loss of genetic diversity as well, which I think is really cool. And so that's just a little bit about these seals, and I'll share this file so you can find all of our sources. Yeah. And how do I stop sharing? There we go. Thanks. Any questions? Love that. Savannah's laughing at me.
You killed it. You killed it. You killed it.
Thanks.
All right. If no one has questions, I'll do mine next because I'm a Eskimo curlew. We good? Okay. I'm gonna give me a second. I have to pull it back up. I gotta find it. Okay, so I'm not going to pull it up so you guys can see it, but I'll just start talking. So me and Hannah looked at coral bleaching. So our little topic was how climate change is affecting marine biology. So basically what happens is when the water heats up and gets warmer, coral will actually release the algae that they have a symbiotic relationship with. It's called zooxanthellae. I think I probably pronounced that wrong. But so when they release that algae, they lose their color, thus the coral bleaching. So they can no longer produce their carbs and they can't do photosynthesis because the algae helps them do that. So when coral reefs die off, they kind of are like an ecosystem engineer in their environment. So it causes a lot of different species that rely on them to die. So one thing we actually looked at, which I know we've talked about in class before, is extirpation. So in certain areas where the coral reefs, like in one area, are dying, you'll have a lot of local species that rely on that one die off. So you'll have that local extinction. One place we looked at specifically was the Beibu Gulf in South China Sea. So this was actually a study that was done a couple months ago, or the article was written a couple months ago. But they recorded that the seawater temperature rose above 30 degrees Celsius this year. And on a typical year in the summer months, it'll get to about 27, 28 degrees. So about 2 to 3 degrees higher than average summers. It also said that overall, the average water temperature compared to historical natural averages is 0.6 degrees higher, which is funny because in the textbook, it talks a little bit about ocean warming, and it says that it's risen about 0.44 degrees over the last 40 years. So this is actually more than the textbook says, which is, the textbook is older. So, now we know it's getting warmer. So it also can cause problems in the ecosystem, like trophic cascades, which is kind of the same thing I talked about earlier with the species that are dependent on them. And then also one point that we brought up was that when the coral reefs are bleached, they're not as pretty, so that can cause a decrease in ecotourism, which would cause like a difference in the economic standpoint of things. So it's not just biologically affecting things. Some of the solutions that we talked about were, we found one about upwelling cold water from the deep ocean, which is a process they've used for other things before, but we found a study that when, like during these heat waves, these warmer months, if you upwell cold water during that time, like regularly, it can actually improve the system and help the coral not bleach. But that would be like a solution for just during the heat waves. Another natural remedy would be like a typhoon, but you can't exactly make those happen. You just kind of have to hope for the best. So that would be a remedy, but that's not something we could do. And then a big major thing would obviously be to decrease carbon emissions, because this is all an effect of global warming. So at the end of the day, the best thing, the longest term thing to do would be to decrease carbon emissions so that seawater temperatures can return to normal. So that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions about coral bleaching? Great. Okay, next person.
Okay, I think I am next. And I will share our outline with y'all just so you have something to look at. Maybe. Okay. Can y'all see that? Okay. So our section that we were assigned was habitat loss and how it affects biodiversity, and we chose to put that in the context of orangutans and palm oil plantations. So basically just to lay out what all these components are and how they work together. Palm oil is one of the most popular forms of vegetable oil, and it only grows in the tropics and it needs a lot of water. So it's a really, it requires a lot of care and uptake, and it also requires a lot of land to grow. And so there's a lot of these plantations. And the main region where it is grown is in Malaysia and Indonesia, which actually those two locations make up 85% of the world's plantations. And this is also home to the orangutans, especially the Sumatran orangutans. They all live in this stretch, and there are down to a few thousand of those. So it affects the orangutans because the plantations make them isolated and removes their sources of food and shelter. 90% of their food sources are in the natural tree canopy. So when these trees are cut down and removed for the plantations, they're removing a lot of their natural food. And they're a very fragile species that doesn't handle change well. So it's hard for them to adjust when their natural food sources and habitat is taken away. And they are listed on the IUCN Red List as critically endangered with a declining population. I believe the first studies were taken in 1999. There were over 200,000 individuals left, and now they're down to a few thousand. So they are in a sharp decline. And why we should bother protecting the orangutan, to put that into context, they are a keystone species for tropical rainforests, so they're really important for holding balance as not necessarily a predator, but for other species rely on them and their movements. They do disperse over large ranges because they're megafauna, so they don't cluster together as often, but they spread out throughout the forest, and they're highly intelligent, so their interactions with people also cause a lot of problems. And thousands of them are killed each year by farmers for the palm oil plantations because they can be destructive if they choose to remain in the plantation rather than dispersing further around the natural forest, the little bit of it that remains. So further into the problems, their forests, their natural homes are being cleared and burned to plant these plantations through the slash and burn method, which is extremely detrimental to the natural environment and can result in erosion and decreased biodiversity. And when the forests are cut down and removed in these large patches, it leads to fragmentation, and they are replaced with homogeneous forests. It's just all palm oil trees. And so those homogeneous forests are really bad for biodiversity and also result in a decline in speciation. There's not many species that can live solely on those trees. The plantations also, again, they reduce the food and habitat available for the orangutans. And the communities have a low genetic diversity, which results in higher chances of inbreeding and lower rates of variability, which is bad for them overall since they are already in such low numbers, so that if a virus or a new predator is introduced, they will have a very low chance of survival long term. And this is also because they have a limited geographic range, and they are a geographically rare species within their environments. So from there, we moved on to solutions, and there are actually some conservation strategies already in place. There's a roundtable on sustainable palm oil, which is a group of